57. We have to. Taking care of it. Then the computers and. Are we talking about 2 minutes, 1 minute? It's because there are things that's happening. I know. Mhm.
Welcome to today's webinar brought to you by the Center for Global Justice. I'm Cliff Durand, your host for today. El Centro para la Justicia Global is located in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. We are a research and learning center to promote a better world and a solidarity economy. For the last 2.5 years, we have been bringing these weekly webinars to you on Zoom. And as a result, we've not had our usual revenue generating programs, which we depend upon to be able to pay our Mexican employees. And so if you can donate, we'd certainly appreciate it. And you can do so on our website, www.globaljusticecenter.org. Today's webinar is about the nuclear threat. Our speaker is David Stea. He will be giving you a presentation of his views of that, and after that, there'll be the opportunity for your questions and comments. So, okay, David, take it away.
First, I apologize for not being able to stand up for the whole length of things, but I'll do so as long as possible. And I'm delighted to see old familiar faces. Most of you I haven't seen for 3 years since the pandemic. This is my first time since the pandemic that I've been in this room. So that's,
Can you be over here?
but
so
this
people-
side is better,
so
okay?
people can See you.
People can see, all right. Oh, yes, I certainly show up on the screen. That's nice. Very nice. Okay. What we're talking about is I had a teacher once who used to start every lecture by saying, all you have to know is, and then said something. So all you have to know is E equals MC squared. You've all seen that? That simple little Einsteinian equation. The energy is mass times the square of the velocity of light. The square of the velocity of light is a big number. So we're looking at the main variable here is the mass. And how do you get to mass, which is referred to usually as critical mass? That is the mass that will give you, in nuclear weapons terminology, a nuclear detonation. And as soon as it reaches that point, multiplied by the speed of light, it takes off. And we've seen this in bellicose situations twice, both in Japan. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were both early nuclear weapons, and they were called fission weapons because the nuclear reaction basically split atoms in vast numbers through a process called the chain reaction. And suddenly you get a whole big bang. And approximating, in the case of Japan, somewhere around 20,000 tons of TNT. Now, the depressing thing I have to tell you is that that's now a pop gun. There are weapons. When I worked from 1957 to 1960 actively with a prime contractor to the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, and I have to admit that I have no official qualifications to work on this. Any titles, nuclear engineer, ergonomist, and others that have been coined since then are brand new titles. They didn't exist. So we started out in the nuclear weapons business as a party of 3. Now, we weren't completely pioneers, because one of the concepts I need to talk about is something that coming out of World War II. So I'm really speaking about somewhere between 80 and 90 years of history now where we are. And in World War II, something strange started to happen, which nobody was told about. And that's that US planes started to crash for no good reason. Nobody could determine initially why a plane which is perfectly capable of flying suddenly plummets to Earth, which it's not supposed to. And so eventually a team of scientists, various people who got to be called human engineers or engineering psychologists or ergonomists, all of the later labels, they began to notice something really strange. And they said, nothing here has to do with a technical failure. There's no reason why the plane can't fly, but the pilots made a mistake. The pilot has looked at a gauge, interpreted the gauge wrongly, the whole array of gauges. I don't have a photograph of say a cockpit of a B-25, but there's a lot of gauges and there's a lot of controls. And what they found was that pilots were confusing these. They had controls that all felt the same, looked and felt the same, gauges that pointed in every direction imaginable. So they didn't know under the conditions of fire, what normal should be, and they did something wrong. Okay, so that was referred to as pilot error, and that was something brand new. We didn't know that there are limits, human limits, to the operation of machinery, and that gave rise to what later we called ergonomics, the science of human machine relations. How do human beings relate to machines, of which an aircraft is one example, and another example, is a nuclear weapon. And that's how our organization got to be. They thought that what applies to fighter planes, fighter bombers, and so on, might also apply to nuclear weapons. People could make mistakes. And the cost of a mistake in the case of a nuclear weapon is thousands of times the cost of a mistake in losing a plane. So we started working on this. We didn't know where we were starting from. We didn't even have a label. We certainly couldn't look it up on an internet because the internet wasn't there. And so we had to operate on the basis, to a large extent, of initially it was initially it was that. Initially it was searching for what could possibly go wrong. Here's a quotation from our mutual friend Guy Perowitz that is supposed to apply to the present day. So, and that's what I'm going to do. I'm really stuck in the 1950s in one side of this, and on the other side, I'm talking about the 2000s. And the guy said this, said in recent years, the public has become aware of the existential threat climate change presents for humanity. But how about the threat of nuclear war and the nuclear winter that will surely follow? Billions of people will either be annihilated instantly or face slow starvation as agriculture collapses. Today, humanity urgently needs nuclear disarmament. Yet most of the treaties that had limited nuclear weapons have been cast aside by President Trump, and the Biden administration is increasing our nuclear arsenal, threatening a new arms race. With a new Cold War developing with China and maybe Russia, the importance of treaties limiting nuclear weapons becomes clearer. The Bulletin of China, and so on and so forth. This is very appropriate time to be talking about this, because it was just last week when President Biden was in Warsaw, and he never explicitly mentioned nuclear weapons. His counterpart Putin did, and said, you know, we're not going to detonate anything, but if you start testing, we're going to start testing too, which meant that the what was left of the earlier agreement, and essentially no testing agreement, was shredded. And that was just a week ago that happened. So we're in a situation now, a lot of my information now, because I'm not working in that field, comes from the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. And they're the ones that developed something that is called a doomsday clock. How long do we have before essentially the end of the world as we know it? It was down to, last week it was 100 seconds, now it's down to 90. So it keeps getting less and less. All right, well, here we are. Now here we are in Feel Good, San Marcos, Feel Good San Miguel. I've done this in other places with other names. It's Feel Good San Miguel. We want, living here, we want to feel good. And I picked up, of course, this week's issue, or last week's issue of Attention, to see if this was in any way being advertised, which it wasn't. All of the articles are about feel good, how we should feel good, and all this. And I mentioned to people what I was doing here today, and they said, oh, I don't want to know about that. And I refer to this as the San Miguel's ostrich solution. We stick our heads in the sand and everything will turn out okay. There's a lot of this attitude around. So I'm not intentionally trying to make people depressed, but I'm saying that, well, here you are, and this is probably about a safer place to be on the planet, but you have relatives elsewhere, like the US, which in the case of a nuclear war would be any place in the US with any population would be a prime target. You have children, few of you may still have parents and other relatives. These are things to be concerned about. So, okay, why should we care? That's one good reason to care. Now, also, what are roots to understanding the sort of perspective that I'm trying to bring in here for 80 years? I mentioned behavioral engineering, ergonomics, human engineering, all those things which didn't exist 80 years ago. And technical issues, well, here are the main technical issues. If you're designing a nuclear weapon, that is a nasty device, it's got to do two things. It's got to go off when it should, and it's got to not go off when it shouldn't. Now, those are two big factors that we spend a lot of time looking at, and that was called reliability. And reliability, and there are all kinds of stories, and I don't have time today. We could go on for weeks about some of the interesting experiments that I was engaged in. I say, in those days, back in the 1950s, and that was when the hydrogen bomb, so-called, the really big bomb, was first tested. In the 1940s, people felt fairly secure because only the US had nuclear weapons, and it had only been tested in battle twice. Then, the end of the 1940s, the Russians had a similar fission weapon. And also at the same time, people were doing research into what got to be called fusion weapons, where the energy output comes not from splitting atoms, but from fusing them together. The energy of fusion, which is much greater. It only happens under conditions of heat, like the surface of the sun. And the only way we could generate that heat was an atomic bomb. So the thermonuclear weapon, as what was called, became a melding of the atomic bomb, which had already been developed and tested, with a new device that was going to produce even more energy. And that was a thermonuclear weapon, or hydrogen bomb, as it's called. I can't go into all the technical details of how these are. Just think in terms, go back to your E=mc², and think the objective initially of the atomic bomb is to get a critical mass. A critical mass could be achieved in a couple of ways. There were two bombs that were dropped on Japan called Little Boy and Fat Man. And Little Boy was called a gun-type weapon. And that is, here we have a gun barrel, and we shoot a bullet into the gun barrel. The gun barrel has nuclear material. The bullet has nuclear material, but it's below critical mass. Put them together, you get critical mass. With critical mass multiplied by the speed of light squared, you get a huge boom. And that huge boom produces so much heat that we're able to put another bomb on it. This is a thermonuclear weapon, which was used for fusing two materials, and the energy that came from that fusing made a much bigger bang. And here's what we're concerned with today. You can see various films. I haven't prepared any because you can see them anywhere. Films of mushroom clouds. In the mushroom clouds, most of the films you see are of either Nagasaki or Hiroshima, or the tests that were done in the US. Before that time, the White Sands and others It all started with an experiment underneath the Chicago Stadium, in which they initiated the first chain reaction, not explosive, but they knew they could do it, and they did. Right, so now we're going from the fission weapon, the atomic weapon, to the fusion weapon, and in going from that, we're going from a scale where you can destroy a city like Hiroshima to a scale where you can destroy a city like Los Angeles or Moscow or New York, because the most powerful of these weapons was several thousand times as powerful as the ones dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There, they said, it was measured at that time measured in tons, equivalent tons of TNT, dynamite. So in the case of Hiroshima, it was about 20,000 tons. That's a big bang, destroyed the city. Now, the ones that they were testing, the ones that I was involved in testing or monitoring and so forth, would be anywhere from 1,000 times as powerful as the Hiroshima bomb to 20,000 times as powerful as the Hiroshima bomb. And that was actually tested by the Soviet Union out in a remote area of Asia. So they had equivalent to 40 million tons of TNT, and you don't want to be under that. And one of our tasks is to make sure that nothing like that ever actually happens. Those big, well, it has happened. It's happened when it was tested inland by the Russians. It's happened when it was tested in the Pacific by the United States and by France. Huge megaton type destinations were there. And the impacts on the inhabitants of the area, even though they might be 100 miles away, the impacts on the inhabitants of the area were truly awful. And that's another presentation. It just, there, in the United States, continental United States, a lot of the impacts fell on, guess whom? Indians. We call them Indians, Indian tribes. The Navajos, which are a pretty populous tribe, there are hundreds of thousands of them, were located, for their maybe this misfortune, on top of the deposits, huge deposits. They got their land because it was assumed the land wasn't worth anything. But when we come into the mid-20th century, suddenly it's discovered that this is huge deposits of uranium. And that's what we want for making bombs. So what do? We hire Navajos as miners to mine the uranium. And do we give them any safety device? Yeah, we can give them a gas mask. As far as I know, every Navajo who was ever involved in this died of radiation sickness. That's, but that whole area where the Navajos and the other majority of the Indian tribes are located got to be called the National Sacrifice Area. So in order to develop nuclear weapons adequately, we have to sacrifice certain things, and the certain things in people, many people. It happened also to islanders in the Pacific, less absolute numbers, but even more horrible consequences. So here we are. Okay, what would happen? What did we do in the earlier days, in the late 1950s? So one of the things we had to do was to move weapons around. Now, atomic weapon is a pretty big item. I can't stretch how big the weapons were at that time. And we didn't have the equipment and didn't want to spend a lot of money on equipment to move weapons. So they discovered there was some kind of machine, and a machine is a vehicle, called the straddle carrier, which was used in the lumber industry. Well, the straddle carrier, kind of like, it's got like the mouth of an insect, you know, and it goes under the pile of lumber and it picks it up like this. And then it's on wheels, so it drives it away. That all seemed nice and simple. The only problem was it was very subject to accidents. You could drive the straddle carrier into the weapon, that would dent it. That's or the straddle carrier might drop the weapon, or other things like that might occur. So one of the things that we looked into to special my project was the likelihood of accidents. And that's one kind of accident. Now, another kind of accident, if I sat down just a little bit. Another kind of accident is occurs in fire rounds. Now, what nobody here who's out of the industry knew is that there were hundreds of thousands of fly around bombers carrying nuclear weapons right over your head. They're all over the place. B-47s, B-52s, everywhere. Now, what could happen with that? Well, suppose you released a weapon that had accidentally been armed. Okay, that's Armageddon right there. Good word. It was something that was they feared it, but everybody was assured that cannot happen. There's just too many levels of safeguards and so forth. And so they admitted there may have been one or two accidents where bombs were released, but they were very much under control. My research showed there were 30-some accidents that had occurred, and a couple of them, the only thing that prevented them from Armageddon is that everything had been armed, but not the nuclear component. So they had an explosion, but it was not a nuclear detonation in these cases. And the other ones ended up in various places, including the US. It was one that made it in the newspapers where a bomb had been dropped on North Carolina. As far as I know, North Carolina is not part of Russia, nor even part of China, but there it was. And I have to put a blanket on this. You get rumors going, active rumors about what could happen. And one of the dangers that was being talked about, and I had to work on too, was how bad would an accident have to be before it had a negative effect on the whole nuclear weapons program. And I measured that in terms of human casualties. How many human casualties? It came out to be 25,000 something, approximately. And then there would be a public outcry that would say, we can't have this. But as it was, in the 1950s, we learned to live with it. Anybody here in school, kindergarten, primary school, in that period of time? Do you ever play duck and cover? Yeah. Oh, yeah, that was one thing. We were going to get protected from a nuclear explosion by ducking under our desks. Now, this is ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. But this was designed to affect public morale. So the public would think there is some kind of solution. There is some way of being safe. And a much more expensive way of doing this was also in the hands of a lot of private individuals, and that is to dig a bomb shelter. And people dug bomb shelters. A lot of them. I even wrote a poem about it. Wrote this play. The bomb shelters were supposed to protect you, a certain amount of earth above them, protect you from the nuclear radiation or anything other than direct hit. And they're still around. I don't know if people are still using them at all, but I think a lot of this faded away because people became more complacent. Nothing had gone wrong since 1945. 1945, we bombed the Japanese into surrender, we thought. And that when you come into the early 1960s, by that time, people were getting tired of the fear of nuclear war, nuclear Armageddon, and that form of death. You need to be reminded every once in a while. Now, one of the things that reminded some people, at least, was what was called the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that's 1962. And the Soviet Union had ships loaded with nuclear weapons to deliver to Cuba. And the US government decided, and Jack Kennedy was president at that time, decided this is unacceptable. We cannot have this. These ships carrying nuclear weapons were being guided by submarines, Soviet submarines, and that's where the problem came in, because there was a simple, this is what they at least regarded as a safety factor, saying it requires the approval of the commanding officer and the political officer in order to launch a nuclear weapon. Those two people. The on a ship called the B-59, the U.S. Navy had dropped a series of signaling depth charges. They were practice depth charges, size of grenades. So there were already little explosions going on. That is, and they dropped them on submarine B-59 at the line of the blockade. And they were unaware that that submarine was armed with nuclear-tipped missiles. In other words, the approval of the commanding officer, the approval of the political officer, they could launch. Right? Something happened. Submarine was too deep to monitor radio traffic, and the captain of the B-59, the Valentin Grigorovich Savitsky, he decided a war might already have started. He had no signals. The war might already have started, and it was time to launch a nuclear torpedo. And so he was ready to give the order to launch the nuclear torpedo. The captain and the political officer actually agreed with this, but by stroke of fate, the commander of the entire fleet, who was Vasily Arkhipov, he was aboard the B-59, and he would not give the agreement to launch. And that is one of the reasons we're all sitting here alive today. The nuclear war, World War III, that could have resulted from this didn't happen. We're all very.
To the date, precise.
It was in October 1962. And I was in graduate school at that time. My major professor disappeared. He just flew in California, and he went off to hide somewhere in the mountains. He was going to be away from any population near in the San Francisco area. He would be away from any populated thing when this happened. And this was the end of a period in the 1950s, before we were sufficiently wary of nuclear detonations and all the things that went with it. People were with duck and cover and bomb shelters and all these other things. People were sort of lulled into a feeling of some safety on one hand. On another hand, they were lulled into, well, you know, it's going to happen. Not right now. Why don't I enjoy my life? Do whatever I can routinely to stay on top of this, but it'll happen. And that was kind of our view. Those who were working in the prime contractor, Sandia Corporation, the prime contractor to the AEC, developed this idea too. Well, it's going to happen. We can maybe make it a little better, a little less damaging, or in quotes, win the war. What would winning a nuclear war amount to? It's impossible to say. There have been movies that were done of this, and other programs that brought the attention of people to this particular problem. And China at that time was not an actor in this. China did develop nuclear and thermonuclear weapons, and it's playing right now on the world stage with various different danger areas. Certainly in the Ukraine war and so forth, there's been a thought about this. Putin has mentioned the possibility of escalating into the use of nuclear weapons. The U.S. is in this area. The same case in the Pacific, there's Taiwan versus mainland China, is another area to be concerned about. There's North Korea. North Korea has nuclear weapons and is doing tests that are very relevant to using these nuclear weapons to attack the U.S. at the U.S. So people, this is a fearful situation. The fearful situation among especially people who don't like to be fearful, and you don't come to San Miguel to get fear wrapped into you. You just hope that this will go away. When I mention it to people over a lunch table or something, usual thing is, I don't want to think about that. Okay, which is one of the possible solutions. In terms of nuclear weapons proliferation, however, we've got to think beyond the US and China and Russia and so forth. India, Pakistan, North Korea, and so forth have nuclear weapons now. They're multi-megaton weapons that are up to 2,000 times the power of the weapon used in Hiroshima. And there have been, however, a certain number of agreements. And these agreements have probably held things at bay at a certain point. Thank God, I don't know what it is. So if I were not a good, solid Unitarian, but a Trinitarian, I would be fearing the wrath of God. The reason why we haven't had any accidental nuclear detonation or actual nuclear war resulting from mistakes and a whole bunch of things is beyond me. We've just been very, very lucky so far. And the nuclear agreements, the weapons limitations, I mean, we're down to sort of an area of like 1,500 weapons. Just imagine the damage we use with 1,500 weapons, but somehow there's a feeling of security with 1,500 weapons instead of 15,000 weapons. So the U.S. and Russia have agreed to limitations. What's going to happen to them now, who knows? But limitations on testing. Where you can test, how you can test. The testing used to be up in the ocean, literally up in the air. It was up for grabs. The U.S. and the Soviet Union tested wherever they felt like testing. They could test underground. There were air tests. There were tests of a variety of hundreds of tests. In the Pacific, there were underwater tests, and so on. So there needed to be some kind of an agreement of limitation on testing. And that did act somewhat. Also, this nice thing, I think this took a lot of the energy away from nuclear weapons, per se, was the peaceful use of nuclear energy. We have nuclear plants all over the globe, all over the place. I mean, there's a country like France depends for a lot of its energy upon nuclear plants. And we know these nuclear plants are subject to some pretty catastrophic accidents, but no nuclear plant has ever yielded a nuclear explosion. So far, so good. There have been 3 Mile Island in the United States. Most people can remember that. And there are other cases in which accidents have happened in what are peacefully nuclear plants that shouldn't happen. We think we have guarded against these. It was inadequate. So we have had nuclear accidents. A lot of plants have been decommissioned. In various areas, people reacted so strongly against having after the accidents. To life, they acted very strongly against nuclear weapons in their living area. So there has been some decommission, but there is some, like in the U.S. case, some nuclear plants that have been built over very unstable areas. There's one right on the Hudson River. New Yorkers could be impacted by anything that went wrong there. And there have been there's one on the Pacific coast that is right on a fault line, where it is a good sized earthquake, and you can have a wonderful reaction from the nuclear plant. It may not result in a nuclear detonation, it may not result in a huge explosion, but it can certainly result in radioactive contamination. If a nuclear weapon, well, where are we? Here we are in the middle. Nobody is talking about San Miguel de Allende as even a possible nuclear weapon target. Who would hoist a nuclear weapon in San Miguel? But not so far away from us, we have two major industrial centers. Right here, we have Leon on one side, we have Querétaro on the other side. Oh, these are nice targets. And if either of these was attacked, and presumably destroyed, the radioactive contamination would also fall on us. Depends on the winds. It all depends on the winds. And so you can check that out. I haven't done it today, but I think we're going to look for today. All right. There are, okay, so we have not had since 1945 a nuclear weapons confrontation in war. But what we have had lots of wars. Why nuclear weapons haven't been involved? There are cases of one of the actors in the nuclear drama is Israel. Israel does not admit to having nuclear weapons, but everybody knows they do. It would be incredible if they don't. So there's one certainly base, a hotspot. Iran, we all think, does not have nuclear weapons at this moment, but we have tacked on a period of time. How long is it going to take to Iran to develop a nuclear weapon or a thermonuclear weapon? That's a big danger in the area. We don't have the best possible data on this subject. I certainly don't have it. So, all right, now 21st century, and that's where we are now. What is the situation, and what are the possible reactions to it? Well, we have something like 8 countries that we know have nuclear arsenals of various sizes. You don't need a lot of weapons. You don't need an arsenal the size of the United States. Every major city, every major dump, every major military place where nuclear weapons are supposed to be has been targeted from the U.S. You know, if we, as we say in the Army, if the flag goes up, these bombs were to drop all over the place. And you've probably seen movies to that effect, where it happens. And accidentally, unintentionally, the flag goes up. So Russians can fear that the U.S. We all know most people here are good Americans, and we would never start a nuclear war. Never start a nuclear war. But there's nasty Ruskies. You can't trust anything they say. So it's a good. This is certainly was a major feature of the commie scare, which enlightened and are emboldened our 1950s attitude. The fear of that everything was penetrated by communist spies, including the presidency, and of course associated with that with the use of nuclear weapons on the part of the communists. So everybody had to watch out what in the U.S. I can't speak for other countries, but in the U.S. there was a big concern about saying the wrong thing and coming to the attention of the FBI, CIA, various other organizations. And this even trickled up to Mexico. You know, there's Sterling Dickinson, for example. Sterling Dickinson kept his big mouth flapping. He started a school that was bringing in soldiers, ex-soldiers from the U.S. that were on the so-called GI Bill. Made us a little bit of money, and it was a lot cheaper to come here. So they came here. He was attracting them to his art school. So the FBI, in conjunction with the Mexican police, decided we've got to get rid of this guy. And so they put Sterling Dickinson into a car and they drove him to the border and they dropped him. And Sterling, being a person of some intelligence, he simply got onto a bus going in the other direction. And in a few days, he was back here in some dangerous figure. He wasn't the only dangerous figure here. There were other people that the U.S. government had their eyes on. They tried to get Mexico full of the communist scare. They had only a partial success with this. The Mexicans wouldn't buy it to some extent. All right, then we have more recently, this is in the case of the Pacific arena, we have the conflict between Taiwan and China, which we didn't think about for a long time. That had been going on for ages. But Taiwan is only about 100 miles from the Chinese mainland. Taiwan has 22 million people. Chinese have a lot more, but the Taiwanese are ready. The Taiwanese are heavily militarized. And so a war between China and Taiwan is not any little minor thing to be concerned about. This is a big one that happened. The nearest U.S. owned base is in Guam, about 1,500 miles away. So yes, they're using their missions, weapons and so forth in Japan. But the U.S. is only nominal control over that. The only one that is secure, that's secure launching point, is Guam. And it's distant. So we're dealing with two enemies separated by about 100 miles versus the enemy separated by 1,500 miles. And there's all kinds of awful things that could happen. Now, so far, the Chinese have kept a lid on this. The North Koreans haven't. They're testing weapons, not necessarily nuclear-tipped weapons, but weapons to see where they can target. The weapons are now capable of targeting the continental United States. We're concerned about this, obviously, for good reason. The North Koreans are not very well controlled in terms of, U.S., of course, would like to have policy control over all of these places. It doesn't work that way. And particularly, it doesn't work that way in the case of Russia. So we're now confronting somebody, we're back to the one person thing. Remember the one person submarine commander who kept us from being nuked. There's a one person head of the former Soviet Union, now Russia, who makes decisions. And I don't think there's a reason to be particularly confident about the direction of his decision. He has threatened indirectly to use nuclear weapons, and that's something to take seriously. All right, so here are all these terrible things that have happened, terrible things that are possibly going to happen currently. What can we do here? First of all, the question, why should you be concerned at all? If it's going to happen, it's going to happen. If it isn't, it isn't. And you're in a relatively safe spot, so it should be okay. And a lot of people, this ties in very well with the ostrich mentality. We put our heads in the sand, we'll be okay. If we don't look at it, it'll go away. And I've spoken with people like this. I raise the subject and they say, I don't want to think about it. I've got my own problems to deal with. Very much a selfie type of subculture, one thing to deal with. All right, then there, if you don't, denial is one factor, obviously. So this can't possibly happen. And remember, I recall back about 5 years ago when I would say, you know, maybe you got to think about President Trump, and they would say, "Oh God, that could never happen," and they go on doing whatever they're doing. Well, we know what happened, and or even worse, what almost happened. If Trump had been in for another term, the likelihood of using nuclear weapons in combat would have been much, probably, everybody predicts, would have been much greater. It didn't happen. We were saved from that as well. Okay, so that's one approach is the head in the sand approach. Another approach is to say, well, we acknowledge it. We all have knowledge of what's going on. We don't know things like the things that I'm bringing up here, but it still is so unlikely to happen that let's turn ourselves more to things that are. I mean, obviously, global climate change in the long run is a more dangerous thing. It's going to hit everybody if it happens. We've got a little time. You know, you talk in terms of a thermonuclear detonation, you haven't got time. So the issue is a very present issue, as the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists keep saying. Now, we've gone for 100 seconds, now we've gone to 90 seconds. It is as dangerous now as it has been in the last 60 years. That is, since the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, according to this one organization which I rely on, that's the factor, a big factor. Okay, another possibility is that we actually do something. And here I go back to one of my heroes, that some of you may remember, Joe Hill. Remember Joe Hill? Did you sing the song? I dreamt I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you and me. But Joe, I said, you're 10 years dead. I never died, said he. I never died, said he. And when he was on the way to being executed, being hanged, he said very few words what his posture was. And we have to listen to it. He said, don't mourn, organize. So what happens? So far, people opposed, by and large, even people who were opposed to the development and use of nuclear weapons have been, to a large extent, individuals, or they've been small groups with no real teeth to them. And so that worried me. I remember one day when I was at UCLA, and Daniel Ellsberg came to lecture, and I was very excited about this. And I came to the lecture hall, big lecture hall, as big as anything we have in San Miguel or bigger, and there was a total of 25 people. And it said 25 people, and he and I walked off the end of it. And he said, what is it? How has interest in this whole problem deteriorated to the point where there were 25 people in the audience? I said, I thought, Dan, what we need is something that is more visible. And what we need is people who were involved in the development of nuclear weapons and all over the place, uniting, coming together and saying what we did was wrong. And it takes quite a bit of country to admit that you were wrong. This is the wrong direction to go in. And it's pointed out very clearly in his books and points. The Pentagon Papers, which caused such a splash, was not about nuclear weapons. That was about Vietnam. And consideration of the use of nuclear weapons in Vietnam was pretty much on the back burner. But this was something on the front burner. And this was something that he had a great deal of experience with. And And I set up a group in Southern California, made the mistake a year later of moving out. And I don't know if the group still exists or not. But they're calling public attention, not only to what happened and what was done, but saying this was not a thing to do. This was not humane, this was not moral, and all of these other issues which issues that started to come up after the 1945 detonation in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The question of, did we have to, this was supposed to take place of an invasion with lots of casualties, did we have to drop the bomb? One question. Or if having dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, did we have to drop the second bomb on Nagasaki? And that raised a whole load of very interesting issues that the necessity of bombing Nagasaki, one of the reasons was we have to show the Russians, we're not concerned with Japan anymore, we have to show the Russians that we have more than one bomb. And we did. In fact, as far as I can determine, we had only 2 bombs at that point, and we used both of them. The other issue, the Nagasaki question, the Hiroshima question, some people believe very strongly that this is immoral, or others will allow that. That would put off the necessity of an invasion of Japan, because Japan was ready to surrender after Hiroshima. But the US had to drop one more bomb just to seal the pact. And that happened. And the US President Harry Truman at the time did not make an excuse for it. He put it all down to military necessity. But whether there was a necessity or not is another question. Now, to wrap all this up, we leave some time for comments, questions, and other things. We here at Mexico, down the other end, we have one reason to feel secure. We're not a target. No indication that any bomb is going to drop on or missiles, other things. I didn't mention anything about missiles, but anyway, there are, if you want to see the whole history of U.S. missile weapons, there's a museum in southern Arizona that has all of the weapons that the U.S. was using in missile form, not the planes, but the missiles. And you can get a lot more information there about the missiles. When I gave the substance of this talk before in San Miguel, I did it as part of a panel of 2 people. The other was a lovely man named Leonard Byrd. Leonard Byrd had been more actively involved later on than I was. He was in the Army, and they had an exercise in the Army, more than one, but this one he was involved in, where they detonated a nuclear weapon and then they moved soldiers in right afterwards. Of course, they had gas masks, but nothing else. All of them, at this point, when I first met Leonard, he was dying of radiation sickness. We gave our presentation a short time after he passed away. He authored one of the most wonderful books that I have ever read, called Folding Paper Cranes. It's a Japanese art form. In this, he's talking about the peace movement in Japan and his involvement in Japan. Initially, he was just a soldier. Later on, he was part of the peace movement. And so we talked about that to a much larger audience of Semi-Alensis at that time. Went over to a lot of excitement, but the excitement cooled off very rapidly. It is, and I will admit, and I can understand fully, it's a subject that people don't want to think about. If they feel there's a way out of thinking this, we won't think about it. We won't work on the issue of how to get out of the situation we're in, and probably it all comes back to Joe Hill. We can't mourn, we have to organize. And there are larger and more powerful organizations that are opposed to the use of nuclear weapons in any war, any shape or form. There's more organization about nuclear power plants than there is about nuclear weapons in the United States and also elsewhere. But the weapons issue, because it's simply too frightening. Anything that happens in a nuclear power plant will happen over a period of time. Anything that happens in a nuclear detonation takes place in a fraction of a second and involves a different kind of decision. And so here we are. And I'm open to any brilliant ideas that anybody has for dealing with this situation. Thank you.
Well, thank you, David. If anyone does have a question or comment, we'd be happy to hear it. Yes, come forward here.
Definitely. But the with these reasons being given, in the case of Nagasaki, they're a little less solid. That is, why did we have to use a second weapon? And one of the reasons, and to my mind, this is the most solid reason, is we had something we had to show to the Russians. Because we were worried about the end of World War II. The peace treaty had not yet even been signed with Japan, and the U.S. With the intervention of people like General Patton and so forth, the former enemies now had to become friends against a common new enemy. So the Russians, who had been allies, were suddenly turned over to energy. We have to show these guys that we weren't kidding. So that's one explanation. There are a number of others, but that one is the explanation for the second weapon.
One thing interesting in the museum in Nagasaki is put on tour.
Sorry?
The museum in Nagasaki or her wish to put on tour, I've been both. It's quite startling to see the actual.
Yeah. The targets, there was ground zero in each case. And they were both, one of them, I mentioned the two types of fission weapons. One of them was a gun type weapon that was like this, and the other was an implosion weapon, where there were a sphere of fissionable material below critical mass, and the whole set of ordinary explosive charges all around the sphere, and they all had to be fired simultaneously. Sphere would then compress, and critical mass to be achieved. So what they did, there was no testing of these weapons beforehand. They said, this is a quote, "We knew they would work," and they did. They did, but they did. What we didn't know was the lingering effects on the population. The population of Japan and old people are still feeling the effects of these weapons. And in spite of this, they've been friends. I don't know.
Also,
Neither Hiroshima or Nagasaki were military targets. They were, there were civilians who, by and large, were killed. So clearly, it was not militarily necessary, though, as David is pointing out, it was politically advantageous.
Also, they probably were afraid that they would do that to California first.
Well, they were, at that point, as far as nuclear weapons were concerned, a hostile power dropping a nuclear weapon on the US is inconceivable. Because nobody else had nuclear weapons. But, the Russians took a number of years before they developed a fission weapon. So we weren't concerned about them. That's them very same way. In the case of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, another important aspect of there not being military targets was they weren't well defended. So a single B-29, the Enola Gay, could fly right over Hiroshima, drop its weapon, very little fear of any interference. Japan was just too far crippled at that point, and by using a non-military target, they were pretty sure it was dead.
You mentioned following the same policy.
So I know they are. Yeah, I have this group in Southern California that I left there. Group may or may not still here. I'm sure there are other groups, but I don't know of them.
You're part of the union of, I'm sure, the union of concerned scientists, that's part of their, is that part of their concern?
Well, the group that I was in, combination, scientists, also military. Military people who have been involved in one way or another, either in the development of the weapon, or testing of the weapons, or some other aspect. That we were all told was a good thing to do. And different feelings about it, but I follow and say the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, which is a major exchange of information, and there's not much on other groups all over the place, small groups, large groups, and so forth, that are trying to bring this issue, bring it back to public attention. So,
I remember during the Cuban Missile Crisis, I was living in Baltimore, and I figured that Baltimore, Washington would be prime targets, and so I decided, well, if we're going to go, might as well go kicking and screaming. And so we had a picket line in front of the White House. Fortunately, we did not have to go, but I mean, that was part of the way of organizing.
yeah, there was the case, I think, not only is the Cuban Missile Crisis important in the sense of being one that almost happened kind of situation, but also because it involved nuclear weapons in all forms. There were nuclear missiles on the submarine, there were nuclear weapons on the boats, they were all over the place. So it was in everybody's face. And people felt, I gotta do something. I either have to act against it during a picket line, organize, or a lot of people ran. They ran to areas they thought could never possibly be nuclear targets, and so they were going to be safe.
You want me to come up here?
No,
I'm not sure, okay, maybe I'll just stand here, is that good enough?
Yeah, well,
Okay.
that's
I wanted to thank you for your talk, David, and in particular for your discussion about a variety of global powers that have nuclear weapons. Because I think, unfortunately, often people on the left tend to think, mistakenly in my view, that we live in a unipolar world where there is only one imperialist power. And when you look at the issue of nuclear weapons, it becomes very clear. The world is divided into competing nuclear powers, each with their own spheres of influence, their ambitions, and so on. And it's precisely the threat that emerges from the clash, the competition of those powers that really threatens us all with respect to the possibility of nuclear warfare. But I wanted to take up your challenge, which you phrase or expression used a number of times during your talk. And that is to suggest that there is a problem because people don't want to think about this issue. And I want to suggest that it's more than just a question of not wanting to think about it. Because in fact, when we look at the history of the anti-nuclear movement, the anti-bomb movement, the ban the bomb movement, the anti-war movement, we see that since World War II, there have been repeated occasions when mass groups of people have mobilized over and over and over again. They have thought of it. They have organized with concern about this issue. You're right, however, to point out that that's not currently the case. So I would argue that it is not so much that humankind is unwilling to think about these issues, because we have evidence that they have been willing to think about them and to act around those issues in the past. Instead, I think we have to ask ourselves what it is about the period between today and the 1960s and the 1970s that explains not only the decline of the anti-war and the anti-nuclear weapons movements, but the decline of lots of other movements in the 80s and the 90s and into the beginning of this century. And I would argue that it's not simply a question of ideas, but it's a question of power and the experience of the neoliberal reaction against social movements and trade unions in Western Europe and North America and so on. And we see the same kind of question coming up today, or the same sort of strategic problem coming up today with respect to the climate justice movement. So just a couple of years ago, we saw mass movements beginning to develop in many, many countries around the issue of climate change. But we also know that in the wake of the pandemic, many of those movements are in a much weaker place. So while I agree with you in general in terms of your concern about this issue, I think we need to dig a little bit deeper into explaining the rise and fall of social movements and protests and so on in order to come up with strategies for how to rebuild those movements today. And so in that sense, I don't think it's just that people don't want to think about it. I think the question is much more, why is it that some people, why is it that sometimes people feel they have the power to act collectively and potentially change the world, and in other periods, they don't have that same sense, that same experience, that same feeling. I think that's the level on which we need to talk about things strategically, much more than just a question of thinking about such issues. But again, thanks a lot for your talk.
Yeah, I would agree, but given more time, I mean, your comments are very appropriate. Given more time, we could go into that somewhat more depth and say, what is the overall context in which all this is evolving or not evolving? I'm going back to the earliest days of my involvement in this in the 1950s, and that is if you raise some of the issues we're talking about here, that would be involved with subversion. Only the communists talk about that. You know, we're right and they're wrong. It's all a black and white situation. None of us who are working on nuclear weapons ever questioned what we were doing. As I had a number of interesting interactions over here with colleagues of mine in this. And what would run through my head, I mean, are people really thinking this way? You know, are people really thinking, well, at the end of World War II, we really didn't do the right thing. What we should have done is ally with the Germans and try to crush Russia. That was the really Black people aren't such bad people. The communists, those are the ones who are. So the question, who's the enemy? In the big complex that we're talking about. You know, we've only got one sphere to work with, globe, world. We have to select an enemy from that. We can't, the Martians, no, we can't use those. But we certainly can use the Russians. We can use the Chinese. You know, and they're fear at that time of rearming former enemies, rearming Germany, which was happening, rearming Japan. Japan refused to be rearmed. Well, all of these issues come into the question, the whole context of nuclear weapons development and nuclear weapons. It was being developed, and at one time when there was a very positive attitude toward this, it was the idea that yes, there could be a war, there could be a nuclear war, it could be pretty bad, but we'll win. And one of the very popular books of that time was called, the title was Thinking the Unthinkable. And it was all about a nuclear war in which the US was going to be, is estimated, you'd lose 60 million people to a nuclear exchange, but it was okay, things were going to be all right and be better. It's a recommended reading for those of you who are not depressed.
Yeah, it was very difficult it was very, very difficult in the early days of the peaceful nuclear development. So I was completely attacked when I made a film in Canada about how the CANDU reactor is better suited to making a bomb than any of the other ones. And the other thing I was pointing out at the time, which is sort of there is no known way to deal with highly toxic nuclear waste.
Again, we have, with regard to the nuclear power plants, one of the huge problems has been, how do we dispose of nuclear waste? And there's been no good system. You do, how deep can you bury it, and what happens when the containers corrode and fall apart and the nuclear material drops? There's always another issue. And the issue is one of those people really don't want to face that much with regard to they're talking about other things with regard to nuclear power plants. They don't deal enough with the question of nuclear waste. Again, an example of this. On the Navajo reservation, Navajo Nation, which I know very well, I worked there for ages. They had there was a big buildup of the ore from which uranium is extracted called yellow cake. The yellow cake was a big buildup behind I won't particular place, the Pecos River. And so all of this yellow cake is behind the dam. And, you know, this reservation is in Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado. It's hundreds and hundreds, more than 500, 600, 700, 800 miles from the Pacific coast. All right, so the dam broke. The yellow cake went pouring into the Pecos River. Pecos River joins other rivers, but empty into the Pacific Ocean, and the radiation level in Los Angeles water doubled in 24 hours. That's all it took. So,
And I assume no one recorded.
yeah, it's but everybody survived, and so we thought we don't think about that like that. We don't think about there was a policy in place where how they came up with this, I have no idea, but the Navajos were encouraged to use the tailings, the waste, nuclear waste, to build houses. And they did. But there's one movie that looks at that. It has somebody takes a Geiger counter, which measures the amount of radiation, and goes up to the wall of one of these houses, and the thing goes crazy. They were using, it's not just Indians, they were in Salt Lake City, Utah, they were using nuclear waste to pave parking lots. Now, it was all this nice, valuable stuff. Let's use it for something. And at that time, they didn't really, they didn't know or didn't acknowledge the potential danger.
If there's any,
Cliff, could I ask a question at some point?
we have Mark Ginsburg.
David, thank you very much for your presentation. It's kind of numbing, but as you say, it shouldn't be. I'm blanking on the name of the historian who argued that in fact the Japanese were ready to surrender, or at least deliberating about that prior to the dropping of the Hiroshima bomb, let alone the Nagasaki one. So it raises the question of whether both bombs were dropped more about geopolitical relations with the Soviet Union. That's the argument of this historian. But the other historian, and again, I apologize, my brain, I think, is maybe too numb to recall, who indicated that there were dozens of times that at least the U.S. Military and government debated whether they would use bombs in nuclear bombs since 1945. The one that stands out to me is during the Suez Canal crisis. There was some serious discussion about whether it was necessary to use nuclear bombs. But the question I have is whether you think, what your thoughts are on the way in which NATO countries surrounding Russia have been given and encouraged to deploy, not yet to use, but perhaps eventually to do so, around Russia with nuclear weapons. I mean, there are, as I understand it, missile launching systems in at least several countries that are part of NATO. And part of the debate I heard before the Russia's invasion of Ukraine was that the concern about the way in which NATO had expanded beyond what it was supposed to, but also that many of those countries were armed with nuclear weapons. Again, I'm not apologizing for the Russian invasion, but I think the context is much more complicated than much of the media in the US provides it. But I'm interested in what you view to be the necessity or the arguments for stationing nuclear weapons in those NATO countries, given that if the US is going to do a strike, it could probably do it, from places within the US.
It could. I don't have the data on exactly which weapons, quantity of weapons that different NATO members have access to. Presumably, it's there somewhere, but I don't have it. But to insert just one aspect of this is that the Cuban Missile Crisis is often presented as, this is the official thing, that the Russians were told by Washington, by Kennedy and those relations, you must not only not deliver nuclear weapons, you must remove the nuclear weapons that are there, or else.
Mm-hmm.
The else part is left out. The else part was Turkey. And this was a quid pro quo situation. The U.S. said, we'll take our nuclear weapons out of Turkey if you will agree not to put nuclear arms in Cuba. And that is supposedly the basis on which this is 13 days. These are terrible 13 days. Supposedly that was the determining factor. And I don't remember which member of Kennedy's administration came up with this, but at any rate, it was quite a decisive role. And so the nuclear weapons were removed from Turkey. Turkey wasn't happy about that. Turkey wanted the defense against, it's not very far from Russia. Turkey wanted the defensive with it, but they didn't have access to that anymore. And the price to pay was, of course, Cuba.
And what about NATO?
Now, what about NATO? All right.
I mean, what's the technical or political logic? The political logic is a little bit clearer than the technical logic. So I'm asking you about the technical part, or military necessity of arming NATO, and then not assuming that Russia is going to react like we did when nuclear weapons were put 90 miles off of our coast.
No, that was a major consideration. This is as close as a nuclear threat had ever gotten. And in fact, look at the submarine fleet, the Russian submarine fleet is as close as they ever got to they operate off the US coast, but as close as they got to actually doing something. Now, I don't have figures on NATO weaponry readily available. The big concern is dispersion. The more nuclear powers you have out there, the greater the danger of something going wrong. Not necessarily nuclear war, something might happen. We talked about accidental detonations. An accidental detonation in any one of the NATO countries could be taken as an act of war by the Russians and could start a lot of things, that it could start World War III. And that's a big concern. So in terms of just distributing nuclear weapons around all of Eastern Europe, I think that's been a major consideration. We don't want to disperse, decentralize too much the control over this nasty thing.
But we have.
I wanted to talk about, I'm glad you raised the issue of the peaceful use of nuclear weapons, which also was raised in this, with another question, because I was at a climate protest in the city where I live in Ottawa, Canada recently, and to my amazement, there were actually people involved in the nuclear industry there telling the nuclear industry and nuclear plants as a solution to the climate crisis. And I was shocked, quite shocked. So I actually went over to talk to them and was given quite a, bunch of bullshit information, quite frankly, about the safety of the newest generation of small modular reactors, which the nuclear industry is touting, and which also produce toxic waste, which cannot be disposed of in any safe way on this planet. And all or very, without a great deal more effort than the nuclear industry has been willing to invest. You mentioned the accidents of 3 Mile Island, also Fukushima, which was not human error, but a question of being on in a place where there were tsunamis and fault lines and so on. And the climate crisis makes the existing nuclear facilities much more dangerous to accident and prone to accident, not just those that are on fault lines, like the one you mentioned in California, but
in all kinds of places where that we can have extreme weather and more threat of accident. But anyway, so I wanted to make that point, that there is, that the nuclear, a lot of people may believe somehow come to be lulled into this false notion that, small modular nuclear reactors are somehow some solution to the climate crisis. They are not. They drain away resources from more sustainable wind and solar and other kinds of technologies that would help. And also they just, the question of the radioactive waste is just has not been resolved in any way. But you sort of threw down the gauntlet, don't warn, organize. And I think that when I looked at the huge climate justice movement that has sprung up, in part led by a 16-year-old autistic kid from Sweden, thousands of millions around the planet mobilized. A lot of them were starting to make the links about system change, the need for system change, not climate change. That there were lots of signs that basically said the system that is promoting the use of fossil fuels, despite the fact that it is, killing the planet, is also the same system that breeds nuclear war, that creates unsafe nuclear plants, regardless of the cost to human health and so on. And I think that we need to link the climate justice movement to a movement that also is against nuclear weapons and against the sort of, criminal use of or promotion of, I'm calling it criminal, but the promotion of nuclear energy as some sort of safe and clean. And by the way, that was what those nuclear officials said, that this was clean energy and so on. So I think we can build, and that's what's needed, a large mass movement similar to the movement we saw in the UK, which was a campaign for nuclear disarmament, similar to the kinds of movements we've seen in the past. I think that there is a clear link between the issues.
There's a certain appeal to the nuclear power movement or the anti-nuclear power movement. It's a little softer, it's a little more peaceful than talking about actually nuclear weaponry. And I've sort of indirectly gotten involved in the issue of nuclear power plants. And that was through, I was 19 years old at the time, and that's a few years ago. And working for Douglas Aircraft in California, and I had contact with a number of scientists at that point. One of them was formerly an immigrant named Vladimir Pavleke. And Vladimir Pavleke showed me this design for a little nuclear power plant. That was his idea, to make small, decentralized nuclear power plants. And this is going back to the early 50s, that people were thinking about that. They still, the same kind of thinking that went through power plant industry, how to make it small and decentralized, was also going to the nuclear weapons industry. One of the areas of research that I was involved in was suitcase bombs. No, there is when the president of the United States goes around various places in the world, there's a person who carries around a little satchel called a football. And the football is basically the nuclear control system to make sure that that's protected against accidental detonation. So the big argument, the positive argument that went around about that time in nuclear weapons is we better do it before they do. And when it was nuclear power plants, it was it's dangerous. We know some of the dangers. We're going to research the other dangers, but basically it's cleaner than other forms of power. You can build nuclear power plants, but we don't have to have fossil fuel plants, we don't have to burn coal and do other things. Nuclear energy, it's a different kind of contamination, but we can contain it. But the argument's gone around that sort of issue. And the further away you get from the nuclear power plant, the more positive people seem to be about the idea.
Norma Harrison has a comment.
Right. That was probably an excellent presentation. I'm sorry the directional microphone lost too much of it, but it's really splendid to hear from you, especially you're among the aged, among the very old and stunning, as though all those years have only contributed more and more to your lucidity and so forth. As to a degree, that's true of me as well. My comment is that there has been 110 years of assault against the incursion of communism. The US hegemony is frightened of it, and they're right. There are owners, and they should be frightened of communism because it will take away their whole behavior, the traditional behavior of profiteering off our owners, theft of our labor, and rape of our land using it. And that 110 years is directly traceable in every case to the war against communism that the Bolshevik Revolution kind of enforced and aided, helped affirm is a valuable thing for the people.
They going back, it's worthwhile, it's our view to have this perspective. You go back to the World War II period when all this began before. During the World War II period, there were, before we knew what nuclear weapons could really do, there was already substantial resort to the nuclear threat. Douglas MacArthur, for example, Douglas MacArthur was the general, the highest ranking general. He was demoted by Harry Truman, but his idea was in the Korean War, we should solve the whole thing by using nuclear weaponry. Just a few nuclear weapons simply solve the problem and the war would be over. There was no consideration at that time on the spin-offs, on other issues or other things. It was a very simple seen at that point by various people like MacArthur as a very simple solution to the problem of war.
They leveled Korea. They leveled it. There was no building standing taller than a foot high.
In which city was that?
At the state, the nation of North Korea.
Oh,
They
yes. Pretty
Just-
thorough job.
I'd like to add another word, and that is we must honor the Rosenbergs. They made that sacrifice of doing that job that needed to be done at the time. Clearly, everybody else has been finding out how to manufacture atomic bombs, but they made Russia a strong opposition to US imperialism for the time being. And were murdered for their effort by the state murderer, which we still allow. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I want to thank all of those who participated in this discussion. And not least of which is David Stea. Next Monday, we will be hearing from Sylvia Federici on feminism. And this Thursday, we will have a film, Fidel, The Untold Story. An excellent film by Estela Bravo. Let me remind you that, that we do need your donations in order to be able to continue to bring these webinars to you. And you can donate at our website, www.globaljusticecenter.org. Let me close then by thanking our team, Liz Mestres, Roberto Robles, Bob Stone, Elizabeth Bowman, Olivia Canales, and myself. And now, this is Cliff Duran signing off from now.